Welcome to this live session for the course Modern Indian Writing in Translation. Hope you are all safe and well. Now, I have received a couple of questions from students who have registered for this course already. And I would like to address the question that is foremost in the minds of some of the participants on this course, which is, what is the format of the end semester examination? The format is very simple. We have 3 sections. The first section asks you to choose the most suitable answer from the options given below for each question. It's a multiple choice question, and the second part asks you to state what the statement is true or false, and the final part is a short note type of question. You'll be given writing prompts, and you will have to write for about 250 words each for each question, responding particularly to the question that has been asked in that writing prompt. So this is basically the format. Now, the students would be most concerned about the nature of the short notes question. How exactly should we respond to it? I think on this course, we also had a short episode, a short video in which I told you how to frame a paragraph, a perfect paragraph. Now, I have with me 2 sample questions and the answers to those questions, which I will share over the course of this particular live session. So what I will do now is take you to the first question. The first question which has been framed by a student on this course goes like this. This is a sample question. In what ways do the poet strike a distinct tone of melancholy in the father's character? And the poem that the student is referring to is Dilip Chitra's poem. So to that particular poem, what is the kind of melancholy that is expressed in the father's character? So that is the question, and this is the answer the student has put together to expand on that idea of melancholia found in the father figure in Dilip Chitra's poem. So the answer is discussed in over 2 paragraphs. This is the first paragraph. In the poem, certain characteristics in the father make it apparent that he is a miserable person suffering from declining years and the monotony of everyday life. His homeward journey from the railway station describes his fragile and weak countenance. His eyes are dimmed by age. He trembles at the edge of the sink when cold water runs down his brown hands and few droplets of water cling onto the grey hairs of his wrist. At the end of a weary day, he is overtaken by weakness. So this paragraph is fairly good in the sense that the student has made a kind of a response to the particular question by stating that the father is feeling miserable, and it could be because of declining years and the monotony of everyday life. And very interestingly, in the succeeding statements in that paragraph, he gives details about the personality of the father. He is fragile, he has a weak countenance, his eyes are dimmed, and you can see, the reference to the gray hairs on his wrist, which are noticeable when he washes his hands at the sink. So the idea of being overtaken by weakness is established very clearly in the first paragraph, and in the second paragraph, the student goes on to offer further details to reinforce the idea of isolation and melancholia. The poet uses a few figures of speech and metaphorical descriptions to hint at the melancholy that is embedded deep inside the mind of the father. The father has unseeing eyes, and his bag full of books is in disarray. He eats stale chapati at night and goes to the toilet to think about his estranged relationship with the man-made world. His children do not engage with him, and he has a loneliness that isolates him from everything. He will sleep at night thinking about the past and the future, and of nomads entering a subcontinent through a narrow pass. The father's character is thus burdened by loneliness, indifference, and alienation that make him melancholic. So, if you notice very closely, there are further details, but those details are sandwiched between two statements which are like topic statements. The first statement is a topic statement, as well as the statement which came at the beginning of the paragraph as well in the previous slide that I showed you. So here is the topic statement for this paragraph, and there's another topic statement here, and followed by that key statement we have details which justify that initial point of statement made by the student. The father has unseeing eyes, and all these details, his isolation is established when he goes and kind of reflects on his life, both inside the toilet and when he goes to bed, listening to that radio, the noisy radio. He thinks of things such as nomads entering a subcontinent through a narrow pass. So all these images of isolation and alienation bring to the forth his extreme loneliness and his melancholia. So you can see how rich this paragraph is. So this is one of the models that you can think of when you're structuring your own paragraph. Make points, make comments, make arguments to begin with, respond to the question that has been asked, and then offer specific details from the text so that your answers are rich and convincing. Now, okay, the poem that I just discussed is Dilip Chitra's poem, in which a father goes home and then he is noticed by his alienated children, his sullen children who don't kind of interact with him. So that's the point that I've been discussing. In fact, I've been showing a sample question and an answer as a response to that particular question about melancholia and isolation. So now, I had another question from a participant about texts from Northeast India, as to the representation of Northeast Indian literature in translation. We do have multiple poets, numerous poets and writers, writing from that region, award-winning writers from the region, and for lack of time and space, I've not been able to kind of represent every region in India, but I did quickly manage to put together a few points which I thought I will share with you to those who are interested in those regions. Here I have Hiran Bhattacharya's poem, These My Words. He's a one of the most famous Assamese poets, and that's his timeline, 1932 to 2012. It's a wonderful poem. I thought I will discuss this poem in brief with you so that that region is also represented as a part of this course. These my words for the young poet. In these my words that have caressed the orchards of my dream is the grace of a lifestyle, the intimate warmth of time. I have no inventions of my own. I am like a farmer. I roll words on my tongue to see how each one tastes. Hold them in my palms to see how warm. I know words are the lusty offsprings of man's noble creation. A mere poet am I in these words that I have relayed from others' shoulders is man's cruel experience and the maulings of history. So it's a wonderful poem, a poem that should be read, several times, both to kind of enjoy the feeling of being embedded in a particular world, a warm world, and a poem that also talks to us about the idea of the poet. The poet becomes a kind of a conduit. If you look at these lines, a mere poet am I in these words that I have relayed from other shoulders. The poet becomes a conduit, explaining, carrying, communicating the ideas and experiences and words of those who had come into this world before him. The writer, the poet, is also talking about all kinds of experiences, including the cruel experience and the maulings of history, the brutalities of history as well. So, in this kind of poetry, you get both the glimpse into that natural world, a world that is rich in natural beauty, orchards. Look at the images, the orchards and the warmth, farmer. So all these kind of images take you to that particular world, and at the same time, it also gives you an idea of the intellectual capacities of the poet who's writing this poem, who is very, very kind of self-conscious about the idea of poetry, about the nature of words. And look at the way he describes words as the lusty offsprings, the outcome of man's noble creation, born out of passion. So it's a poem that makes you enjoy both the natural world, which come through in the poet's images, as well as it makes you enjoy the poet's subjectivity in terms of his his representation of the job of a poet and the job of words and poetry. And at the same time, it kind of gives you a trace of the violence, the cruelties that are also part and parcel of the human experience from that world. So I hope you just explore further in this big domain of writers who are frequently taught in Indian literature classrooms, and I do have a list of poetic voices, a few poetic voices from Nagaland listed out on this slide. Temsila Au, Ichrin Iralu, Nini Lungalang. So all these writers write in the state language in English. And Jyotirmoy Pradhani states that their writings narrate the unique tales of the people and the land that have remained substantially enigmatic and exotic for an onlooker, but their writings have proved yet again how human predicaments and experiences are essentially universal. So you get a sense, a taste of that idea in Bhattacharya's poem that I just briefly discussed. So earlier I did receive a question about modern Indian writing and its characteristics. It's a massive question. It's a fantastic question. What are the features? What are the characteristics of modern Indian writing? So it's a massive field with numerous writers writing across the nation. There's no very easy answer with a few pointers, but I will try to kind of list out. Inevitably, that's what one can do within this limited time period that I have. So gender is a massive question, as you would have noticed through the discussions of the several texts on this course. So if you look at older texts, there would not necessarily have been a very critical approach to the idea of gender, but that becomes overt, that becomes apparent. There's a self-consciousness about gender in modern writing, and I can go with a very easy example. Let's take Tagore. I mean, Kabuliwala is a text that many of us would have read. It's a very iconic text, very popular, and the word modern comes up in that story, and it is uttered by the father of this young child, Minnie. And it's very interesting when he says that we try to raise our child in a modern way. I'm paraphrasing the words of the father. We are a modern Bengali family, and we try not to kind of burden this young child with adult notions, notions which are suitable to a grown-up, such as marriage and attendant ideas of mother-in-law and father-in-law. So that is a fantastic moment, I would think, in all of Tagore, for me at least, because modernity means you don't kind of condition a very young child with ideas of marriage and the in-laws house at a very early age. So modernity would entail letting the child have a childhood and not kind of introduce her drastically into an adult world. So that's one example of the self-consciousness about issues of gender, and you get that very early on in Tagore's Kabuliwala. You can get other examples as well. If you take a look at the Lost Jewels of Tagore, there you see one of the characters in that story discussing at length what is masculinity, what is femininity. So it's a very, very modern understanding of what is outdated masculinity, what is modern masculinity, what is the ideal kind of relationship between man and woman. So all these ideas get kind of rehearsed in that story. So if you kind of do a big jump from Tagore to, let's say, Amrita Pritam, the Stench of Kerosene, the story that we have read for this course, there again, you do get multiple, lenses into that idea of gender with the mother of the central male protagonist being very conservative, who just wants a grandchild, and how she's responsible in kind of killing the daughter-in-law. So we have a romantic notion of marriage. We have a very conservative opinion, and we finally see a man, the central male protagonist, who is kind of oppressed by all the burden of conservatism. So these are some of the notions, and then we have ideas of class. We have we have discussions about what is a mature individual. The figure of the poet also is a major subject of concern in modern Indian writing as well. So these are some of the major concerns that you can see in modern Indian writing. Okay, so I have another question coming in through a participant who says that can you comment on the women's contribution? Yes, women's contribution have been pretty high. I'm going to take an example from a couple of examples from the South. Kamala Das, the Sahitya Academy Award winner, and who's well known across the globe. And if you look at her short stories and poetry, I'm going to take her short story, Summer Vacation. It's a fantastic short story where you can see, Kamala Das dealing with several concerns, the concerns that are the usual fare of modern Indian writing. What are those concerns? So we have a young child questioning class, the child, the grandchild of Muttashi says that, says to her grandmother, how can you give stale food to that servant's daughter? So the idea of class is being questioned, and Muttashi feels embarrassed, and she kind of hurries and offers fresh food to the servant's child. So we do get all those, discussions done in a very subtle manner. We do get representations of the region as well, with the matriarchal transfer of property. So we get the sense that Amu is going to be the next heir. Yet there is a nostalgia, the nostalgia for the old world order, and that you can see in the figure of that young child Amu, who longs to be with her grandmother, who kind of fears that she's not going to see her again when she returns from Calcutta for the next vacation. So it's a story which has multiple concerns at its heart, and the loss of a mother as well. So it's very interesting that mothers are quite often absent in some of the writings, and there again there is this question as to why they are made absent, both in women's writing as well as in men's writing. So it's a kind of a trope that seems to kind of parallel the Gothic trope as well. So it's very interesting in that regard. So the writings of women, for example, let's say Salma from the south. I mean, if you read that very small poem, it kind of makes the strange world unfamiliar. It's an uncanny world that we are in Salma's poetry, poem called Perspective. She's a young mother who's torn between the world, the domestic world, and the world that she longs to belong in, which is the world of writing and reading. So she sees herself as if she's a bat hanging upside down on a tree. So it's a very bizarre image, but at the same time it's a very poignant image as well, which captures the status of women in society. So it's very good in that regard. So South Asian women writing. Somebody wants me to comment on South Asian women writing. What I can do right now is I can comment on the idea of gender in Indian writing, which is what we are concerned about right now. So across the nation, if you look at those tribal poems as well, Chill Out and what the other poem, I have given birth to a son. So you can see parallels in all these poems. Chill Out, the male speaker is shushing his beloved, asking her to kind of chill out, occupy herself by eating chili while he can, play the flute and be part of a community. So it's very interesting in that regard, because we see parallels between Chill Out and Salma's perspective. She's caught between the four walls of domesticity, and she is left to take care of the private sphere, whereas her partner is absent from that textual space. Gifts, because she has she has won. That's basically the utmost achievement that she can achieve in her life. So I have tried to kind of focus on some of the writings from the South, because they are not very much brought to the fore. If you look at texts from I have looked at Nagamandala, Karnat's Nagamandala, where you get a conflation of the to a modern reader, and it has a very interesting ending as well, and I want the students to think about the different endings. It's very that question asks you to think about village and is shown to live a happy life with Aparna and their son. She is no longer locked up in the house, no longer doubted by Aparna, and even has a servant to draw water from the well for her. Her position in society, from being nondescript, is now secure. Looking at her life from this point of view, it can be said that Rani finally gets everything she's ever wanted and is content. Now, if you look at the first paragraph, you get several details which follow that topic sentence, and the topic sentence gives you the status of Rani at the end of the play. She becomes a goddess, she's perceived as a goddess, and she is revered by the husband as well, and life seems to be perfect. So that's what the first paragraph tells you. Life is secure, she has a help, the ex-mistress now becomes a servant, and it seems as if Rani finally gets everything she's wanted. And the second paragraph, you can look at the complications that are discussed by the student. However, it can be said that Rani is still confined within the patriarchal structure of society. It can be argued that she fell in love with a man who came to her at night with Naga and not with Aparna. And in both endings, Naga never comes to her as a man again, only as a snake. Rani, however, cannot say anything, for she cannot reveal the truth about Naga to the village or to Aparna. To ensure that she is safe, she must be with Aparna to all intents and purposes, happy and content. This is the only form of happiness available to her within the patriarchal structure, to go back to a man who has ill-treated her and is now contrite. So in this section, you get those two endings that I've been talking about. The first ending in which Naga commits suicide and all is well, and everything is accommodated, and the second ending, Naga comes to live in Rani's hair. The shortened Naga comes to live in her hair, and she accepts both these figures, both these male figures in her life. So that is the postmodern ending, the modern ending, and we get these two. But there's no break from Aparna. That is constant. So the student is very, the student has very cleverly brought that idea in. Therefore, it can be said that superficially Rani gets everything she wants at the end of the play, but a closer look reveals that she's still possibly trapped and unhappy, although perhaps not as overtly as before. So it's a very nuanced response to that question. So superficially Rani is all well and good, but a closer look tells us that she is possibly trapped. So look at that adverb, possibly, used to make this answer not the final one, and although perhaps not as overtly as before. Okay, so these are some of the concerns that you should keep in mind, especially on how to structure your answer. I would like you to think about how to particularly respond to the questions that have been asked to you in the end semester exam. So I would be also very grateful if you could come across your opinions, if you could share your opinions on the text that we have read over the course. We have looked at Gulzar, we have looked at Mantil, Sundar Ramasamy, and other figures. And so I would be grateful if you could talk about those two and ask your questions with regard to those texts. Kannada, I've told you in terms of Karnad. In terms of Karnad, we have looked at how mythology, how folktale has been transferred to a modern audience. So in terms of Gulzar, we have partition text. The idea of partition is also discussed in a very sophisticated manner in Crossing the Ravi. So it's a fantastic story which takes a mature look at that idea of partition. So it's a very different story to Thobatek Singh as well. Thobatek Singh takes a very satiric look at the idea of partition, whereas Gulzar's is as a mellowed response to that idea. So you can compare the responses of these two writers to the same subject. Okay, there's a question here. Is there any critical theory emerging from India to read and analyze Indian texts from the native point of view? So this is a very good question. In fact, I was hoping for a question like this, and I want to go back to Ramanujan's idea, A.K. Ramanujan's idea about a translation. He says that a translation is to be true to the translator, no less than to the original. So this is a fantastic idea where the emphasis on the identity and character of the translator is also very, very important and significant. So he goes on to clarify, A.K. Ramanujan goes on to clarify that the process of translation is about choice, interpretation, and assertion of taste, a betrayal of what answers to one's needs, one's envies. So the translator's proclivities become important, and the interpretation of a text, of an original, also depends on the character of the translator, his experience or her experience, and his tradition. Everything is kind of involved in this idea of translation. So it's a very interesting point that we need to keep in mind. And we do have similar comments, such as from Ayyappa Panikar, who says that a literal word-by-word rendering of the original from the source language to the target language will not work. It has to be kind of true to the spirit of the original. So you need to be very sensitive to the context. And that's also what Kalyan Raman, another translator from the south, has pointed out. So he says that literary texts in any Indian language other than English emerge from the literary tradition of that language and from the life and history of that language community. So it's not just the text that is important, it's the community, it's the tradition, it's the history of that community which is equally important, and we need to a translator needs to be very sensitive to those contexts when he is doing the act of translation. So what he says is that we need a discourse in English on translated text that is alive to these contexts and is also able to meaningfully map these works to a wider Anglophone milieu. So I hope, Kavya Dikshit, I hope I'm kind of addressing your question even marginally there by referring to all these practitioners and critics of translation. So we saw what A.K. Ramanujan feels, what Ayyappa Panikar feels, as well as what Kalyan Raman. And I would also like to share what Gayatri Spivak has commented on this idea of translation. Spivak, Gayatri Spivak says that unless the translator has earned the right to become the intimate reader, he or she will not be able to respond to the special call of the text. So there's a special call that the text has, and if the translator is not an intimate reader, then he or she will not be able to do a great job of translating. So how do you become an intimate reader? That becomes the next question. You become an intimate reader by being sensitive to the context, the context that Kalyan Raman had just pointed out. So these are some of the concerns that we need to keep in mind. And in terms of this course, Modern Indian Writing and Translation, the texts are representative. There are, as I said, numerous texts out there, numerous regional writers writing in the native languages of India, and these texts are being translated into English, and there's no way you can capture everything, all the texts, onto a course like this. The best that you can do is discuss the idea of regionalism, the wealth of literature that comes from a particular region, and how it has been translated in this language of English, and be sensitive to both the regional context and to the kind of the loss as well as the gain that is accrued to a text when you share this regional text to a whole lot of people. So modern Indian writing and translation, this course run by me is not very thorough in the sense I don't have a text from Rajasthan, I don't have a text from Kashmir. So what I have tried to do to the best of my capacity and to the best of my expertise is talk about texts that I am very familiar with as a literary practitioner, and that would mean a proliferation of texts from the south and the texts that are popular, but I'm encouraging you and prompting you to look at the text in your region. You could be from West Bengal, from Orissa, so you can go back to your text and apply these principles of translation and these ideas onto the texts that have evolved from your region, and to see what's lost and what's gained through this act of translation, and how do you find the traces of the element of the regional in a text that has been translated. It's a very interesting exercise as well. It's an interesting exercise in the sense that you can try to follow some of the clues that have been left on the text by the translator, which connects the text to a particular region. For example, if it's Kamala Das, the moment you read names such as Muttashi, Amu, you would know, oh yes, this is from Kerala. And again from Bashir's The Blue Light, or Bhargavi Nilayam, all these certain words kind of take you back to the world of Kerala. And if you look at Perumal Murugan's story, The Man Who Could Not Sleep, certain words which have been transliterated into English, say for example Karpati, and even some proverbs which have been transcribed into English by the translator. All these cues and clues take you very, very quickly to the land in which that text emerged from, and Gold from the Grave, that text from Mumbai, and the terms, the Kannada term Tola, all these words, Kurla, the town, all these words take you back to that particular suburb, to that particular city about which this story is set and discussed. And you might want to think what is significant about this particular text from this region, and you might want to kind of discriminate between what is the significance of the regional, what's the significance of the universal values that's kind of emerging from this text. So what are the regional values and what are the universal values being, in for example, in Gold from the Grave, there's the idea of greed. I mean, if you're too greedy, there will be severe loss suffered by you at the end of the story, which is what happens to Bhima. And the regional values, it kind of gives you a glimpse into the problems suffered by people from that particular region, the issue of migrancy, the lack of work, and so on and so forth. So you get glimpses into particular concerns from particular people from that region. So that's how you kind of approach these texts that have been included as part of this course, as well as across the rest of India. Let me see if there are other questions. Okay, now let me talk about some of the interesting aspects of regionalism, which can be looked at closely For example, in The Hunger of Stones, I call this story as the regional resistance to the colonial. That's the angle, the ideological angle that I'm using to look at this particular story. There's a particular paragraph in this tale, The Hunger of Stones, which can be read critically. There's a point in the story when there is a sudden whirlwind which swept down, carrying the sand of Shishta and dead leaves from the Aravallis like a pendant, and bore away my jacket and my hat. They went cartwheeling through the air, a sweet chorus of laughter swirled along with them, rising through several octaves, sounding every note on the scale of derision, until finally it dissolved into the sunset. So this particular excerpt from Tagore tells you how the regional is resisting the inroads of the colonial. So what is the regional? The sounds of Shishta, the dead leaves, and all this, the elements of nature are trying to chase away the accessories of the colonial tax collector. His hat is being snatched, his jacket is being snatched by the winds, and it's a very symbolic resistance on the part of the land itself against the colonial employee and the employee of the East India administration. Now let's look at Perumal Murugan's The Man Could Not Sleep, so resisting social climbing through regional metaphor. So the very interesting point about the story is, the story deals with human emotion of jealousy, which is not dealt with in detail by many works in the Indian context. So it's an interesting human emotion that has been dealt with very, very powerfully by the writer here. And we have two figures, Murugesan and this older man. I mean, both of them are very poor, but you can see the competition between the two, described in a very, very visceral manner by the writer. So this is a story about a fight for survival, and you can see the cultural structures that define relationship between the young and the old, and you can get the regional cues as well, which the regional cues tell you that the story is about power dynamics, and the power dynamics is not between the rich and the poor, it's between the poor and the poor, and that therein lies the irony. So Murugesan is not someone who belongs to our upper strata in life, so it's very interesting to see how this human emotion of jealousy is preventing somebody from climbing to a better social position. So we have narratives of hierarchy. We have the narratives about the old guard, the older grandfather-like figure who's trying to suppress the young from rising up in society. So all these are entangled within this trajectory of slight social advancement by the young, and they come to a head in the project of house building. So it's a very interesting subject. We don't usually get such topics in Indian writing. The idea of human jealousy being discussed in such great detail. Now I want to talk about Nagamandala and the postmodern regional resistance to patriarchy. In Nagamandala, we have, as I said, the contemporary audience being involved, symbolically involved, in the sense that if you look at the structure of the play, the audience is asked to kind of pay attention to certain aspects of the play. And as I said, the dual endings imply a plurality of possibilities. So this postmodern element, the idea of instability, uncertainty, is something that we have seen even in Tagore as well. It's kind of a circular ending in Tagore's The Hunger of Stones, in Lost Jewels as well. We have a kind of an uncertain ending, and we have uncertain endings again in Girish Karnad, with Karnad saying, okay, take whichever ending that you please. So all these uncertainties is a modern characteristic as well. So do pay attention to the structure of the narrative too, be it poetry, be it story. The structure is equally important. And if you look at Sundar Ramaswamy's Tamarind history, it's very episodic, and that episodic nature in itself is a very modern aspect. And for the first time, we have a Tamil regional speciality captured in a very, very powerful manner through the story of the tree. And the emphasis on the emphasis in the novel also tells us about some of the concerns of modern Indian writing. Trade becomes important, winning beautiful women, and also becomes equally important. The rise of the newspapers can also be seen through the importance given to newspapers and their editors. So all these concerns are beautifully mapped in Sundar Ramaswamy's novel. And let me just revise regional poetry very quickly before we call it a day. So in regional poetry, we do see gender identities in translation. So we get a sense that regional identities are taking a backseat and universal concerns come to the fore. Of course, in Dilip Chitra's poem, we did see the impact of capitalism on the human psyche, resulting in alienation, isolation, and melancholia. In the father figure who's unable to connect with anybody within his domesticity, the children and the father seem to be estranged. And very, very interestingly, the mother figure is also not represented. Once again, as I pointed out, there is a sense of the absence of mothers. Be it Kamala Das's Summer Vacation from Kerala to Dilip Chitra's suburban poem, we do get a sense that the mothers are absent or oppressed. In Gold from the Grave, we get Bhima constantly shushing the conscience, his wife, who kind of warns him about the dangers of stealing from the dead. So, they are absent, or they become the oppressed conscience as well of these literary texts, these literary psyches. So it's a very interesting absence that we can see. So if you look at some of the regional poetry, the one that I haven't addressed, Kedarnath Singh's Where Would I Go? It's a very beautiful poem. We get the sense the speaker is no longer alive and he is refusing to leave the world. He says that where on earth would I go if not, stay back here. So he gives us a lot of details, in the poem, and those details show us how very closely tied up to materiality a man's identity is. Unlike the case of female identity, there are numerous material structures to which the man is connected, and that in itself tells the world that the man is not going to go away from the public spheres. So it's a very interesting poem in that regard, and it universalizes the regional, the ideas that are particular to particular landscapes. So it doesn't matter whether the masculine identity is from the south or it's from the north. There seems to be uniformity in many respects in this context. So the masculine identity and the female identity overlap across various regions, at least from the text that we have been looking at for this course. So that's very unique. I mean, as I said, there are two ways you can look at it. One is the regional way and the other is the universal way. What do we get if we collect the regional cues? What are the significances of regional cues? And when we look for regional cues in many of the poetry, the regional cues seem to be taking a back seat, at least from the poems that I've looked at, and the universal values come to the fore. The universal values being the values of a mother, the values of a wife, the values of an oppressed homemaker, homemaker, and we get the other side as well, the alienated father who is oppressed by the pressures of work and the fast pace of the globalized world. And at the same time, we do get a man who is very much in the world, the male who is part and parcel of the materiality of the world. So we do get universal constructs about various identities when we look at these poems and structures. So my advice would be, from my experience that I've gathered by looking at these texts, is what are all the the regional traces that you can get. For example, in Amrita Preetham's The Stench of Kerosene, there's this reference to the bluebell wood. I mean, when I first read it, it's a fantastic image. So the idea is that in the story, if somebody passes through the bluebell wood, they become deaf. That's what is mentioned in the story. And Gulevi tells this to her husband Manik, you seem to have passed through the bluebell wood. You don't seem to be listening to whatever I have been saying. And that is a brilliant image, I would say, because she very indirectly addresses the notion that the husband is not listening to the wife. He seems to be cut off. He seems to be alienated from the woman, and that bluebell wood becomes a kind of a symbol of all that is wrong with that domesticity. Manak being unable to communicate his fears to the wife. So that's how we kind of look at. So there are different ways and means in which the regional world is addressing its own cues, its own cultural values, its own cultural constructs, and is imparting that, to its own inhabitants and citizens. And that is exciting, the ways and means in which the particular culture has its own, elements to address and a space in which you can talk about certain issues. So once you kind of get hold of those regional cues, you can talk about it. You can see what are the impact and resonances that regional cue has for the text. So it's an exciting project that you can embark on when you look at the regional traces that is still left over in the translation into English or other languages. So these are some of the ways and means by which you can find a lot of meaning in these texts. And of course, whenever there is a chance, do go back and see if you can read some of these texts in the original as well, and see the differences in meaning in these two texts as well, the original and the translated text. And once again, we need to remember that the translated text is not inferior to the original as well. The translated text is as important, equally important as the original, and it's not a version of the original. It is a text which has its own credibility and legitimacy, and has to be read for its own right as well. So these are some of the frameworks that you can keep in mind when looking at the text for this course. And I would like you to kind of go and read all the texts in detail, because if you look at the end semester exam pattern, multiple choices, true or false, unless you read the text, you will not be able to kind of respond to particular details that are being checked in the exam. And the details are important, particularly important for this course, because there is a lot of cultural currency. There's a lot of cultural significance in details. What is for example, what is the animal that is being used in the poem of Salma's perspective? If that's the question, you should know that the animal that is used by Salma to talk about the confined, the upside down world of the woman is the bat. So the bat is a sign of bad omen. It's a bird of ill omen, and very, very ironically, the speaker seems to kind of identify with the bat because her life is upside down. So all these details become significant, which means you have to read and reread the text in order to come to grips with the point that the writer, male or female, is trying to make through these works, be it poetry or the play. So I think in a live session, the comments that one makes is very broad and pretty quick, and but you would really enjoy if you go back to the lecture videos for particular weeks where we take all these texts pretty slowly, and there's a lot of in-depth discussions about multiple perspectives. So I would really advise you to go back to those lecture videos and catch up on them, revise them before you come for the exam. And live sessions, this is all you can get, very broad brushstrokes, repetitive points about some of the texts that are very powerful and that stay in one's mind. And from the questions that I have received over the chat, all the questions are very broad and none of them seem to pertain to the specific text that we have read. So but I do hope that you have read all the texts that are referred to in the course. Those are texts that are worthy of being read at least once, if not several times. And the novel that I've chosen is a novel that kind of represents the entire Indian nation and the making after independence, the struggles several citizens undergo as they kind of make this transition from a colonial nation to a free nation, where press, trade, and individual lives and the right to happiness are of central concerns in this novel, and those concerns are reflected across the nation as well. So I've tried to kind of map certain very important concerns of Indian writing through these texts that I've chosen, and I'm sure there are other texts which talk about other concerns, other concerns which are important to Indian writing. So do feel free to go back and read other texts, and if you want, you can make references to these other texts that you've read in translation as part of your responses to this end semester a paper. And I would welcome various readings of other texts as well. You can make those texts represented when you're talking about them in comparison with the text that I have included in this course. So read as much as you can. In translation, I encourage translated texts by purchasing books which have been translated, works that have been translated, and poetry is very difficult to translate, but we do have fantastic translators trying their hand at translating poetry. And you can see how the images are undergo a drastic change when they are captured in English. So try to read translations. Do encourage this domain, and it's a fantastic field as well. If there are any other questions, feel free to write to the email that have been given to you as part of this course, and I'm sure me and the TAs on this course would be very happy to respond to your questions and concerns. And the sample questions and answers, I would make sure that they are added to the course portal so that you can go back to them and check how it has been structured. So structure is very important. Whatever you write, make sure you write in a structured way, make your points, make your arguments, and offer details to justify your argument. So I really hope that you enjoyed being on this course. So I hope this has encouraged you to go and look at writings from the various Indian regions, and I hope this has introduced you to several readers and several writers across India as well. So thank you for being part of this course, part of this journey. It's an exploratory journey by its very nature. There are multiple writers who have not been found out, who are writing about their particular region. They have not yet been translated as well. So if those regional writers have to be have to be introduced to the wider world to make sure that their region gets the limelight, their lives become important, their creativity becomes important. So the onus is upon us to even try our hand at translating certain if you're very familiar with that particular regional language, then you can even try translating those works so that many people get to know about that particular region and its creativity. So thank you for watching. Have a good evening.